What would you do if your closest companion started acting like a stranger? Natalya had no idea her beloved dog knew something that could shatter their perfect home. And Carlos, he was about to learn that trust can crumble faster than it's built. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting warm amber light across the quiet house. Natalya stood by the kitchen counter, absent-mindedly stirring her tea. Everything seemed normal, but the air carried an unshakable tension. Dakko, their loyal Labrador, sat rigidly by her feet, his intelligent eyes darting toward the front door as if expecting something or someone. When Carlos returned from work that evening, Dakko didn't greet him as usual. Instead, the dog stayed glued to Natalya, his tail wagging softly but his gaze fixed with uncharacteristic intensity. Carlos frowned. This wasn't like Dakko. "Rough day, buddy?" Carlos asked, crouching to pet him. Dakko gave a low growl, not menacing, but firm, and shifted closer to Natalya. She laughed nervously, brushing her hair behind her ear. "He's just being protective," she said, but her voice carried a note of uncertainty that Carlos didn't miss. Over the following days, Dakko's behavior became even stranger. He followed Natalya everywhere, to the kitchen, the living room, even standing guard outside the bathroom. At night, he would position himself at her side of the bed, a barrier between her and Carlos. It was almost like Dakko was shielding her from him. Carlos's initial amusement turned into quiet irritation. "Why is he acting like I'm the villain here?" he muttered one morning as Dakko once again blocked his attempt to hug Natalya. The dog growled softly, his tail thumping on the floor in what looked like a warning. "Maybe he's jealous," Natalya joked, trying to lighten the mood, but the uneasy look in her eyes didn't go unnoticed. Carlos began watching them more closely. Natalya seemed different too. She'd always been playful and open, but now she looked distracted, as if hiding something. When she thought he wasn't looking, she whispered to Dakko, her hand stroking his fur in a way that felt almost conspiratorial. One evening, Carlos decided he'd had enough. Standing at the edge of the living room, he crossed his arms and watched as Natalya sat on the couch, Dakko's head resting on her lap. "What's going on here, Natalya?" he asked, his voice sharp enough to cut through the silence. She froze, her hand pausing mid-stroke. Dakko's ears perked up, and for a moment, the room felt like a pressure cooker ready to explode. Natalya opened her mouth to answer, but the words didn't come. Instead, she looked down at Dakko, as if seeking his approval. Carlos's stomach churned. What was she hiding, and why did it feel like his own dog was complicit? The silence in the house wasn't peace, it was a warning. Carlos felt it in his gut. Something was wrong. And this time, he wouldn't let it slide. The following morning, Carlos woke up with a pounding determination. Dakko's constant hovering around Natalya wasn't just odd anymore. It was invasive. As he sat at the breakfast table, watching Natalya and Dakko exchange their usual quiet looks, an unsettling thought gnawed at him. Was he missing something right under his nose? "I'm staying home today," Carlos announced, folding his arms across his chest. Natalya, mid-sip of her coffee, froze. Her wide eyes met his, and for a fleeting moment, he saw fear. "Why? Is everything okay?" she asked, her voice light, but her hand trembled as she placed the mug down. "Just want a break," he said casually, masking his intent. Dakko's head whipped toward him as if he understood the subtext. The dog's body stiffened, and he moved closer to Natalya's chair. The day dragged on, with Carlos pretending to scroll on his phone while covertly observing Natalya. She seemed uneasy, avoiding prolonged eye contact and bustling around the house more than usual. Dakko never left her side, his shadow-like presence more pronounced than ever. By mid-afternoon, Carlos decided to test his theory. He approached Natalya in the kitchen, reaching out to hug her. Before he could get close, Dakko sprang between them, his tail rigid, a low growl rumbling in his throat. "Dakko!" Carlos snapped, his patience finally fraying. "What is your problem?" Natalya stepped in quickly, her hands gently pushing Carlos back. "He's just protective," she said, her tone too soft, too rehearsed. Carlos wasn't buying it anymore. Protective from what? From me? Natalya, this is ridiculous." The tension between them simmered. Dakko's eyes darted back and forth as if trying to gauge the situation. Carlos couldn't shake the feeling that the dog was more than just a passive observer. He was a participant, guarding a secret Carlos wasn't privy to. Later that evening, Carlos's suspicions hit a boiling point. While Natalya was in the shower, he noticed Dakko sitting by her discarded purse. Carlos approached slowly, his heart racing. As he reached for the bag, Dakko growled low and threatening, his teeth bared just enough to send a message. "What the hell is going on here?" Carlos whispered under his breath, his pulse hammering in his ears. He backed away, hands raised in surrender, but his resolve hardened. Whatever Natalya was hiding, he was going to find out. No matter what. What if the person you trust most is hiding something in plain sight? Carlos was on the verge of uncovering the truth, but would it set him free, or destroy everything he believed? Carlos couldn't sleep. The weight of suspicion bore down on him, keeping him awake as the clock ticked past midnight. Beside him, Natalya's even breathing filled the room, but Dakko's presence at her side of the bed was an ominous reminder of the growing divide. The dog's eyes glinted in the dim light, unblinking and watchful, as if daring Carlos to make a move. By dawn, Carlos had made up his mind. He would follow Natalya, quietly, subtly. Whatever she was hiding, he needed to know. Waiting for her to leave the house, he stayed behind, pretending to be engrossed in a work call. When the front door finally closed behind her, Carlos grabbed his jacket and followed at a distance. Natalya's path wasn't random. She walked briskly, Dakko trotting obediently beside her. Carlos, maintaining a careful distance, watched as she stopped at a small park, a place they rarely visited together. She sat on a bench, her hand absently stroking Dakko's fur. But she wasn't alone for long. A man approached, tall with a confident stride. He sat down next to Natalya. They exchanged a few words too quiet for Carlos to hear. Dakko oddly didn't react to the stranger. In fact, the dog seemed comfortable with him, even wagging his tail as the man reached down to pat him. Carlos's breath hitched. Who was this man? And why did Dakko, who had been so hostile toward Carlos lately, act like this stranger was an old friend? Steeling himself, Carlos moved closer, keeping behind a line of trees, his ears strained to catch fragments of their conversation. "Don't think he suspects anything," Natalya said, her voice carrying a mix of nervousness and resolve. "Good," the man replied. "We need more time. Just keep playing it cool." Carlos's heart pounded in his chest. More time for what? Playing it cool? The words echoed in his mind, each one twisting the knot of unease in his stomach tighter. As the stranger handed Natalya a small object, something metallic that glinted briefly in the sunlight, Carlos felt his restraint crumble. Stepping out from behind the trees, he marched toward them. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his voice sharp and accusatory. Natalya's head snapped up, her face draining of color. The man stood abruptly, his hand hovering protectively near his pocket. Dakko growled, stepping between Carlos and Natalya. The dog's stance was firm, his loyalty clear. But was it loyalty to Natalya? Or the secret she was keeping? "Carlos, it's not what you think," Natalya began, her voice trembling. "Then tell me what it is," Carlos shot back, his eyes darting between her and the stranger. "Because I'm done with the lies." The air between them felt electric, charged with tension and the promise of answers Carlos wasn't sure he wanted. For a moment, everything stood still. The man, Natalya, and even Dakko, as if the entire scene was suspended on the edge of a knife. 43 episodes led to this moment. Natalya thought she had control, Carlos thought he knew the truth, and Dakko, he was about to reveal whose side he'd been on all along. One final move could destroy everything. The storm outside mirrored the chaos brewing inside the house. Rain lashed against the windows, the wind howling through the cracks like a warning. Carlos paced the living room, his fists clenched, his jaw tight. Across from him, Natalya sat, her expression unreadable. Between them, Dakko lay sprawled on the floor, his tail twitching with tension, as if even he sensed the impending explosion. Carlos broke the silence first. "I know you've been lying to me. Don't insult me by denying it anymore." His voice was sharp, cutting through the oppressive atmosphere. Natalya's lips parted as if to protest, but she hesitated. Her eyes flicked to Dakko, who lifted his head, ears perked. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. "Say something!" Carlos shouted, slamming his hand down on the coffee table. The force rattled the objects on its surface, but Natalya remained still, her gaze unwavering. Finally, she spoke, her voice low but steady. "You wouldn't understand, Carlos. It's bigger than you. Bigger than us." Carlos laughed bitterly, running a hand through his hair. Bigger than us? Don't you dare make this sound noble. You've been playing me, Natalya. You and whoever that guy is. And now Dakko? He pointed at the dog. What? Is he in on it too? Natalya's face twisted with something that looked like guilt, but she said nothing. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small black device. Carlos froze. What the hell is that? He demanded, his eyes narrowing. The reason I've been doing all of this, Natalya replied, her voice trembling slightly. You think I've been lying to hurt you, but the truth is, I've been trying to protect you. Carlos's eyes darted to the device, then back to Natalya. Protect me from what? Before she could answer, Dakko stood up, his body tense, his eyes locked on Carlos. The dog's posture was unlike anything Carlos had ever seen before. Rigid, almost military. It was as if he was waiting for a command. Natalya, what's going on? Carlos asked, his voice dropping to a whisper. You weren't supposed to find out this way, she said, her voice barely audible, but now it's too late. The next moments unfolded in a blur. Dakko moved first, lunging toward Carlos, but not with aggression, with purpose. His teeth clamped onto the device in Natalya's hand, pulling it free and darting away. Natalya gasped, scrambling to her feet as Carlos stood frozen, trying to process what he'd just seen. Dakko, no! Natalya shouted, chasing after the dog. Carlos followed, his heart pounding. The storm outside had picked up, the thunder rumbling like a drum roll to the climax of their unraveling lives. Dakko led them to the back door, where he stopped, turning to look at Carlos with an expression so human, it sent chills down his spine. The device hung loosely in the dog's jaws. Natalya reached for it, but Dakko growled, a deep, guttural sound that stopped her in her tracks. For the first time, Carlos realized the dog wasn't protecting Natalya. He'd been protecting something else entirely. What is it, boy? Carlos asked, his voice breaking. Dakko dropped the device at Carlos's feet and stepped back, his gaze unwavering. Carlos bent down, his fingers trembling as he picked it up. The screen lit up, revealing a countdown timer. 10 seconds. Natalya, what is this? He shouted, spinning to face her, but Natalya didn't answer. Her face was pale, her eyes fixed on the device. 9, 8. Carlos, you have to trust me, she whispered. Destroy it. 7, 6. Why? He yelled. What happens if I don't? 5, 4. Because it's not just our lives at stake, Natalya said, tears streaming down her face. It's everyone's. 3, 2, 1. When whispers replace trust, even silence becomes dangerous. Natalya's quiet words to Dakko weren't meant for Carlos to hear, but he was about to uncover the truth she couldn't hide anymore. The house was too quiet. Carlos stood in the hallway, his heartbeat echoing in his ears as he strained to catch the faint sound of Natalya's voice. She was in the kitchen, speaking softly, too softly, and she wasn't alone. Dakko's low whine punctuated her whispers almost as if he was responding. The tone wasn't playful, it was conspiratorial. Carlos's breath hitched as he crept closer, each step deliberate, his socked feet soundless against the hardwood floor. We can't let him know, Natalya's voice carried, just above a murmur. Carlos froze mid-step, the words stabbing through him like shards of ice. Not yet, not until we're ready. Dakko whined again, his nails clicking softly against the tile as he shifted. Carlos peeked around the corner. Natalya was kneeling on the floor, her hand resting on Dakko's head, her face inches from his. The dog's posture was rigid, his ears twitching as if processing her every word. It was more than odd. It was unsettling. Carlos stepped forward, his shadow stretching into the kitchen. Not until you're ready for what? He demanded, his voice cutting through the stillness like a blade. Natalya spun around, her face pale, her eyes wide with alarm. Carlos, I didn't hear you! She stammered, but her hand stayed firmly on Dakko's head, as if grounding herself through him. What's going on, Natalya? Carlos pressed, taking another step closer. And don't say nothing, because I've heard enough to know that's a lie. She opened her mouth, but the words seemed to catch in her throat. Instead, she looked at Dakko, who stared back at her with unnerving intensity. The silent exchange made Carlos's stomach churn. Natalya, stop looking at the dog and answer me, he barked, slamming his hand on the counter. Dakko's head snapped toward Carlos, his lips pulling back in a low growl. Carlos froze, his eyes narrowing. You've got to be kidding me. Now he's growling at me? Natalya stood abruptly, placing herself between Carlos and Dakko. He's just upset. You startled him." Her tone was soothing, but her hands were trembling. "Carlos, please, let's just talk about this later." "No," Carlos said firmly. "We're talking about this now. What's going on with you and the dog? What are you hiding from me?" For a moment, Natalya seemed to consider her options. Her gaze darted to the door, then back to Carlos as if calculating an escape route. Finally, she sighed, her shoulders slumping. "It's not what you think," she said quietly, "but you're not ready to hear it." Carlos let out a bitter laugh. Not ready? Natalya, I've been in the dark for weeks while you and that dog have been. I don't even know what. Try me. Tell me what I'm not ready for." Natalya's lips pressed into a thin line, her hands clenching at her sides. Dakko let out a low, almost mournful whimper, as if sensing the weight of her hesitation. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "It's not just about us, Carlos. It's about everything." Carlos frowned, his frustration boiling over. "What does that even mean? Stop speaking in riddles, Natalya. Just tell me the truth." But before she could answer, Dakko stepped forward, positioning himself between them. His gaze locked on Carlos, and for the first time, Carlos felt an overwhelming sense of foreboding. It wasn't just suspicion anymore, it was fear. What do you do when the ground beneath you starts to crumble? Carlos had no idea that Natalya's secret would lead him to question everything he thought was real, including himself. Carlos's chest heaved as he stood in the center of the kitchen, the weight of Natalya's cryptic words pressing down on him like a vice. Dakko remained rooted between them, his intense gaze fixed on Carlos, almost daring him to take a step closer. Natalya's silence was worse than an outright lie. It felt like betrayal wrapped in a shroud of ambiguity. "Enough of this," Carlos growled, his voice sharp enough to cut through the tension. "If you won't tell me the truth, I'll find it myself." "Carlos, stop," Natalya said, her voice trembling but resolute. "You don't understand what you're walking into." "Then help me understand," he roared, slamming his fist against the counter. The sound echoed, startling even Dakko, whose ears flattened briefly before returning to their alert position. For the first time, Natalya looked genuinely afraid, not of Carlos, but of what he might uncover. Her hands clutched the edge of the counter, her knuckles white, as if bracing herself for an impact she couldn't stop. "You think this is about us," she said softly, shaking her head. "But it's bigger than that. Bigger than you, me, and even Dakko." Carlos felt a surge of frustration. "Stop talking in riddles, Natalya! Just say it!" Natalya hesitated, her eyes flicking to Dakko once more. The dog's unwavering stance seemed almost calculated, as if he knew something Carlos didn't. "Fine," she said, finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "You want the truth? Follow me." Without another word, she turned and walked toward the basement door. Carlos blinked, momentarily stunned. Natalya rarely went down there, it was mostly storage and old junk. Why now? "What's in the basement?" Carlos demanded, his feet rooted to the floor. "Answers," Natalya replied without looking back, "but once you see, there's no going back." Dakko followed her, his movements smooth and deliberate, like a soldier on a mission. Carlos hesitated for a fraction of a second before his curiosity overwhelmed his fear. He trailed behind them, his mind racing with possibilities. The basement was cold and dimly lit, the single bulb casting long shadows across the walls. Natalya stopped in front of an old wooden chest, her hands hovering over the lid. Dakko sat beside her, his eyes locked on Carlos. "Open it," Natalya said, stepping aside. Carlos hesitated. His gut screamed at him to walk away, but his pride wouldn't let him. With a deep breath, he crouched and lifted the lid. The hinges creaked, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. Inside was a collection of items that made no sense. A stack of faded photographs, a metal box with strange markings, and a small vial of some clear liquid. Carlos reached for the photos first, his hands trembling as he flipped through them. Each image was of Natalya, younger, smiling, but always with Dakko by her side. The dog didn't look a day older, even in the pictures that were clearly taken years ago. "This doesn't make any sense," Carlos muttered, his eyes narrowing as he examined the vial. "What is this?" "It's the beginning," Natalya said cryptically. "And the end." Carlos's head snapped up. "The end of what?" Before she could answer, Dakko let out a sharp bark, his body stiffening. Natalya's face turned pale as she grabbed Carlos's arm. "We don't have time," she said urgently. "They're coming!" Carlos's blood ran cold. "Who's coming?" Natalya didn't answer. Instead, she grabbed the vial and the photos, shoving them into Carlos's hands. "Take these and go, now."